Each testimony builds a stronger case. Every sharp focus reveals clarity. Learning your legal rights, upholding unyielding justice.
Sir, we need to speak with you. May we come inside?
What's this about? I'm busy right now.
We received a report regarding your daughter's iPad. Some concerning files were uploaded to the cloud.
Her iPad? I don't know what you're talking about.
Sir, the service provider flagged the content and contacted us. We have a warrant.
This is a mistake.
It was an afternoon in January when that front door opened and the agent's body camera captured what was on the other side. A man in a blue t-shirt, confused expression, with a black girl in a floral dress standing behind him, holding a red cup with both hands. The way children hold things when they don't know what is happening, but can sense that something is wrong. The timestamp in the upper right corner of the recording read January 14th, 2025, 3:45 in the afternoon. It was an ordinary Tuesday. The girl had probably just come home from school, and ICE agents were at the door of her house because an iPad had given away her location without anyone, not her, not her father, not the agents themselves, having fully understood what that meant until it was too late. The story that led to that moment at the door began weeks earlier in a chain of events that mixed technology, bureaucracy, and the kind of institutional error that only becomes visible when it has already caused enough. Damage to no longer be ignored, an iPad, a location application, a tip that originated from digital information misread by people who had the authority to act on it, but not the care necessary to verify what they were actually seeing. That combination placed federal agents at the door of a family that had done absolutely nothing wrong, and the body camera that recorded the moment that door opened would become the central evidence in everything that followed. The man who opened the door was named David. He was American, born and raised in the same state where that house stood, married for 11 years, father of 2 children. The girl behind him was his youngest daughter, who was 7 years old that January afternoon, and who at that specific moment probably did not understand why there were uniformed men in front of her house looking at her father with that expression. David understood even less. He had arrived home from work less than an hour earlier, had helped his daughter take off her coat, had put water on to boil for tea, and was in the middle of a completely ordinary afternoon when the doorbell rang and the world outside his door turned out to be something entirely different from what he expected to find. What the agents were looking for was not David. It was not his daughter. It was a completely different person with no connection to the family whatsoever, whose whereabouts had been associated with that address through a chain of digital inferences that started with location data from an iPad and ended with a federal operation on a Tuesday afternoon in a quiet residential neighborhood. The problem was that the chain had failed at a fundamental point. The moment when someone should have verified whether the digital data corresponded to a real person at that real address before authorizing any action. That verification did not happen, and the result was recorded on the body camera with date, time, and the face of a 7-year-old girl in the background. If this is your first time on this channel, welcome. What this story reveals about technology, power, and the consequences of acting without verifying goes far beyond this specific case, and you are going to want to follow every section to the end. Hit subscribe right now and tell me in the comments, did you know that the location data from your phone or tablet can be used this way? Write yes or no down below. The body camera kept recording while David tried to understand what was happening at the door of his own home, with his daughter behind him and federal agents in front of him. That recording, which the agents wore on their chests as standard documentation protocol, would become, in the weeks that followed, the most important evidence in a lawsuit that would cost the people involved far more than any of them had calculated on that January afternoon. Because what the camera showed was not a well-executed federal operation that had found the wrong person by chance. What it showed was the result of a series of negligent decisions that should never have reached that door on that afternoon with that child caught in the middle. It had all started with a location-sharing application installed on an iPad that belonged to David's oldest daughter, who was 12 years old, and used the device mainly to do homework and watch videos on weekends. It was a common application, the kind parents install on their children's devices to know where they are, with a simple interface and a function that seems harmless, until the data it generates reaches the wrong hands and is interpreted by people who do not have enough context to understand what they are looking at. The application automatically synced the iPad's location with a linked account, and that account, for a series of reasons that the subsequent investigation would take weeks to fully reconstruct, had been associated with a profile that was on ICE's radar. The person ICE was looking for was named Rosa. She had entered the United States some years earlier on a temporary work visa that had expired and had remained in the country after its expiration without regularizing her status. There was a pending deportation order in the system, and when ICE received information suggesting that Rosa might be located through digital data associated with a certain profile, the agency authorized an investigation. Up to that point, the process had followed a recognizable logic, however imperfect. The problem began when the analysts responsible for interpreting the location data made an error that any additional verification would have immediately revealed. They confused the device with the person. David's daughter's iPad had been purchased secondhand through an online electronics resale platform about 8 months before that January afternoon. The seller was a distant cousin of Rosa who had wiped the device before selling it, or at least had attempted to. Some accounts and settings had remained partially linked to the original profile in a way that was not visible to whoever used the iPad day to day, but that appeared in data tracking systems as an active connection between the device and that profile. When ICE began monitoring the location data associated with Rosa's profile, what they found was the iPad signal, which at that point was in David's oldest daughter's backpack, going back and forth from school every day, spending weekends at the family's residential address. From the perspective of the analysts looking at that data on a screen, the pattern appeared consistent with someone living at that address. The location returned regularly to the same point. There was daytime and nighttime presence. There was the kind of regularity that tracking systems associate with a fixed residence. What the analysts did not do, and this is the failure that the subsequent legal process would place at the center of everything, was cross-reference that location data with any additional verification about who actually lived at that address. A basic public records search would have revealed that the house was registered in David's name. An American citizen. A utility records check would have shown the same. Any of the elementary steps that exist precisely to prevent this kind of error had been skipped, and no one in the approval chain had required them to be completed before the operation was authorized. The authorization for the operation was signed on a Friday. The agents were briefed the following Monday, and on the afternoon of Tuesday, January 14, 2025, a team of 3 ICE agents arrived at David's residential address with the operational conviction that they were going to the right place to find the right person. None of them had seen a photo of Rosa before arriving. None of them knew that the family living at that address consisted of a white man, his black wife, who was at work that afternoon, and 2 daughters, one 12 and one 7 years old. None of them had been informed that the link between the address and the profile they were investigating was based entirely on location data from an electronic device, with no additional human verification. David opened the door knowing none of this. He saw the vests, saw the uniforms, saw the expressions, and the first thing he felt was not fear, but genuine confusion, the kind that comes when the reality you are seeing does not fit into any context that makes sense. He had done nothing. His family had done nothing. He paid his taxes, had stable employment, had lived in that house for 6 years without a single incident, and yet there were federal agents at his door on a Tuesday afternoon with body cameras recording, and a 7-year-old daughter behind him trying to understand why her father had suddenly gone so quiet. What happened in the minutes that followed was recorded in every detail, and every detail would matter far more than anyone present in that moment could have imagined. The agents explained the reason for the visit in the technical and economical language that operations of this kind tend to produce, with no room for nuance, no opening for context. They were there in connection with an immigration investigation. There was a profile associated with that address. They needed to verify the status of all residents. David listened to all of this with that expression the body camera captured in detail, and that anyone watching the video later would immediately recognize as the expression of someone trying to process a reality that makes no sense. He was American. His family was American. He had bought that house, signed that mortgage, lived at that address for 6 years. The idea that there was an immigration investigation connected to his front door did not fit into any context available to him in that moment. What David did next was something many people in the same situation would not do, not out of lack of courage, but out of lack of knowledge about What is legally possible when federal agents are at your door? He did not step back. He did not invite the agents inside. He did not begin answering questions about the residents of the house or about anything else. He stood at the door, with his daughter behind him, and asked to see the documentation authorizing that visit. There was no search warrant. The agents had what the agency called an administrative order, an internal document that authorizes ICE agents to investigate suspected immigration violations. But that does not carry the same legal weight as a judicial warrant and does not authorize forced entry into a private residence without the resident's consent. That distinction between an administrative order and a judicial warrant is one of the most important and least understood in the context of ICE operations at private residences. An administrative order is issued by the agency itself, without review by an independent judge, and does not satisfy the Fourth Amendment. Requirements for entry into a home. A judicial warrant, on the other hand, is issued by a judge after an assessment of probable cause, and that one does authorize entry regardless of the resident's wishes. David did not know that distinction in technical legal terms that January afternoon, but he knew, by instinct and common sense, that he had the right not to let people into his home without a clear legal reason, and that is exactly what he exercised. The agents remained at the door for nearly 20 minutes. During that time, the body camera kept recording everything. David answered some general questions, but refused to provide detailed information about the residents of the house, or to permit entry without a judicial warrant. The 7-year-old daughter remained visible in the background for much of that interaction, moving between the entrance and the interior hallway with the red cup still in her hand, unaware of the details of what was happening, but clearly affected by the tension that had taken over the space that should have been the safest place in the world for her. At some point during those 20 minutes, David picked up his phone and called his wife, who was at work, and then a lawyer whose number he had saved for a reason that afternoon turned out to have been one of the best decisions he had ever made. The attorney guided David by phone in real time, while the agents were still at the door. That guidance was clear. Without a judicial warrant, David was not required to let the agents in, was not required to provide information about the residents, and was not required to answer questions beyond confirming his own identity. David followed that guidance with a composure the body camera documented precisely, and that would later be cited by his attorneys as evidence that at no point was there obstruction, at no point was there confrontation, at no point was there anything that justified the continuation of that operation at that address. There was only a father at the door of his own home, exercising constitutional rights that exist precisely for situations like that one. The agents withdrew after 23 minutes, according to the body camera's timestamp. They left without having entered the house, without having found the person they were looking for, and with a recording that documented every second of an operation that should never have reached that address. David closed the door, turned to his daughter, and tried to explain what had just happened in a way that a 7-year-old could understand without becoming frightened. That conversation, which he would later describe in testimony as one of the most difficult things he had done as a father, revealed something about the real cost of that institutional error that no legal document could fully capture, because poorly executed federal operations do not only affect adults who understand what is happening. They enter homes where there are children who will go to sleep that night carrying an image they should never have had. David's wife, Camille, arrived home less than 40 minutes after the agents left. She had left work immediately after her husband's call, driven above the speed limit for much of the way, and come through the front door still in her coat with her bag on her shoulder. The kind of hurried arrival that communicates before any word is spoken that something had changed in that house that afternoon. What she found was David sitting at the kitchen table with the attorney still on the phone, the youngest daughter watching television on the couch with a silence that was not the normal silence of an occupied child, and the oldest daughter in her room with the door closed and the iPad, that specific iPad, in her hand. Camille listened to the full account, sat in silence for a moment, and then said something that David would later describe as the phrase that defined the direction of everything that followed. She said that this could not simply end there. Camille had personal and profound reasons for reacting that way that went beyond that specific day. She had grown up in a family that had experienced unjustified police stops, had seen up close what happens when institutions of power treat certain people as suspects by default, and had developed over her lifetime a finely tuned sensitivity for recognizing the difference between a genuine mistake and a mistake that happens because certain types of verification simply are not performed when certain families are on the other side of the door. She did not yet know all the details about how the iPad had become the center of that operation, but she knew there was a body camera that had recorded everything, and she knew that recording needed to be preserved before any internal administrative process could make it disappear. The attorney who had guided David by phone specialized in civil law, not specifically in federal misconduct cases, but he had contacts, and one of those contacts was a firm in Washington that had litigated cases against federal immigration agencies before, and had developed through those proceedings a very precise understanding of where the agencies were vulnerable and where they had the capacity to defend themselves. When David and Camille's case reached that firm 2 days after the incident, the partners' reaction was immediate. They asked for the body camera recording before anything else, before discussing strategy, before talking about fees, before any other conversation. The recording first, because the recording was the foundation of everything. Obtaining the recording was not straightforward. The agency did not hand it over voluntarily. It required a formal request through the Freedom of Information Act, accompanied by a legal notice preserving all rights related to the incident and explicitly warning that any alteration, editing, or destruction of the material would be treated as obstruction. That notice was sent the same day the firm was retained, with a speed that the agency's attorneys certainly recognized as the signal that the other side knew what it was doing. The agency had 45 days to respond to the formal request. David and Camille's firm used those 45 days building the rest of the case, collecting evidence, reconstructing the chain of decisions that had led that operation to that door. The reconstruction of that chain revealed a problem that went far beyond the technical error with the iPad. There was a written protocol within the agency that clearly established the verification steps that needed to be completed before any residential operation could be authorized. That protocol existed precisely to prevent the kind of situation that had occurred at David's home, and it had been ignored in a documented manner at least 3 distinct steps in the approval of that specific operation. This was not a case of a non-existent or ambiguous protocol. It was a case of a clear protocol, available, known to those involved, and deliberately skipped, because someone at some point in the chain had decided that the location data was convincing enough to justify bypassing the confirmation steps. That decision, made in a room far from that house in that neighborhood, had placed federal agents at the door of an innocent family with a 7-year-old girl holding a red cup. When the recording finally arrived, after a bureaucratic battle that consumed more time than the 45 days allowed and required an additional court petition to force delivery, David and Camille's attorneys watched the complete video in silence in a conference room in Washington. After the file ended, the senior partner of the firm was quiet for a moment, and then said there were 2 elements in that recording that made the case particularly strong. The first was the absolute clarity with which the video showed there was no justification for that operation at that address. The second was the child, not because her presence was manipulative or would be used in a sentimental way, but because she made it impossible to argue that the operation had been conducted with the minimum care the law requires when federal agents approach a private residence. A child visible in the background throughout that entire interaction was the most silent and most powerful evidence that something had gone fundamentally wrong long before that January afternoon. The lawsuit was filed in federal court on a March morning, 47 days after the incident. The document was 62 pages long and named the agency, the 3 agents individually, the analyst who had interpreted the location data without additional verification, and the supervisor who had signed the operation's authorization, knowing or having reason to know that the confirmation protocols had not been followed. Each defendant was named for a specific and documented reason, with precise references to the points in the decision chain where their individual responsibility could be established. It was not a process built in anger or urgency. It was a document constructed with the methodical coldness of people who had spent weeks placing every piece in the right position before presenting the whole. The central allegations were 3. The first was Fourth Amendment violation, because the operation had been conducted without a judicial warrant and without the emergency conditions. The law recognizes as justification for dispensing with one. The second was serious operational negligence, because the approval chain had ignored established internal protocols that existed specifically to prevent operations based on unverified data. The third was documentable emotional harm caused to minors, an allegation the attorneys had included with specific evidence and that transformed the presence of the 7-year-old daughter in the video from contextual detail into a central legal element. That third allegation was the one that most concerned the agency's attorneys, because it was the hardest to refute with procedural arguments and the most likely to resonate with a jury in a way that transcended the technical details of the case. The agency responded to the lawsuit with the standard strategy that federal institutions use when they cannot deny the central facts, but are unwilling to acknowledge them. They argued sovereign immunity for the agency as an entity, qualified immunity for the agents individually, and attempted to frame the entire situation as a good faith error committed by professionals acting within the reasonable limits of their operational authority. The qualified immunity argument is a legal shield that protects government agents from personal liability when their actions, even if wrong, did not violate clearly established constitutional rights that any reasonable person in their position should have known. It is a high standard of protection, and in many cases it works, but it has a very clear limit, and that limit is precisely the point where David and Camille's attorneys had built the case most carefully. For qualified immunity to hold, the agency needed to argue that a reasonable agent in the position of those three professionals could legitimately believe their conduct was constitutional, but the internal protocol that had been ignored existed precisely because the agency had already acknowledged in its own documents that operations based exclusively on digital location data without additional identity verification represented a risk of constitutional violation. In other words, the agency itself had documented that it knew about the problem and had created a procedure to avoid it. When that procedure was ignored, the argument that the agents could not have known they were violating constitutional rights collapsed completely, because there was an internal agency document saying they should have known. That detail, the existence of the internal protocol as evidence of prior institutional knowledge of the risk, was the moment when the agency's attorneys understood they were on far more difficult ground than they had initially calculated. They had assumed they could frame the case as an isolated technical error, the kind of thing that happens in complex operations and that courts tend to treat with some deference toward agencies. But the combination of the ignored protocol, the body camera showing a child, in the background throughout the entire interaction, and the detailed reconstruction of the decision chain that David and Camille's team had produced in the weeks before, the filing created a picture that was far harder to defend than a simple operational error. It was a picture of systemic negligence with human consequences documented on video. Conversations about a settlement began informally through intermediaries before the formal responses to the lawsuit were even fully exchanged. That early movement toward a negotiated resolution confirmed what David and Camille's attorneys already suspected, that the agency had made its own assessment of the video, the ignored protocol, and the minor children allegation, and had concluded that a public trial with those central elements presented before a jury was a risk the institution was not willing to take. What was not yet clear, and what the negotiations would take weeks to resolve, was whether the agency was willing to accept the conditions that David and Camille considered non-negotiable, because they had decided from the very beginning that any agreement that did not include real and permanent consequences for the people responsible for that operation was not an agreement worth signing. The agreement was reached on an afternoon in June, 5 months after that January Tuesday that had begun like any other afternoon, and ended with a body camera recording the face of a 7-year-old girl in the background of a federal operation that should never have existed. The negotiations had been long, and at several points had seemed close to collapsing, especially in the moments when the agency tried to preserve the jobs of the agents involved through internal transfers that would technically keep them in service while removing them from direct operational roles. David and Camille had rejected that solution with a firmness their attorneys described as absolute. A transfer was not a consequence. A transfer was problem management. And they had not spent 5 months in federal litigation to accept problem management as an outcome. The 3 agents who had appeared at the door that afternoon were dismissed from the agency as a condition of the agreement. The analyst who had interpreted the iPad data without performing the necessary verifications was dismissed. The supervisor who had signed the operations authorization without requiring that protocols be followed was dismissed with loss of service-related benefits, a consequence that, in the context of federal agency careers, is significantly more severe than simple termination. 5 people lost their jobs because of a second-hand iPad, a partially linked account that no one had verified, and a series of negligent decisions that had placed federal agents at the door of an innocent family on a Tuesday afternoon. The financial value of the agreement was never publicly disclosed due to a confidentiality clause the agency had insisted on including, and that David and Camille's attorneys had accepted, after ensuring that all non-financial conditions were fully met and publicly verifiable. But beyond the amount paid, the agreement included 3 institutional obligations recorded as binding conditions. The first was the complete and documented revision of the identity verification protocol before residential operations, with the implementation of at least 2 independent levels of confirmation that needed to be completed and recorded before any authorization could be granted. The second was the creation of a periodic external audit mechanism for these operations, conducted by an entity independent of the agency. The third was the incorporation of the case, with all the details of the failure and its consequences, into the mandatory training of all new analysts and operational agents. Camille gave an interview a few weeks after the agreement was signed. She had been the driving force behind the decision not to accept any exit that did not include real consequences, and had also been the person who had insisted that the institutional obligations be as central as the financial value in the negotiations. She said something in that interview that circulated widely in the weeks that followed, not because it was dramatic or inflammatory, but because it was precise in a way that captured something legal documents cannot fully express. She said the problem had never been the iPad. The iPad was just the mechanism. The problem was that someone at some point in that chain had looked at a residential address, seen a location pattern that could have belonged to anyone, and decided that verifying who actually lived there was not a necessary step. And she said that decision had a name, even if no one at the agency was going to admit it out loud. David returned to work the week after the agreement was finalized. The daughters went back to school. The oldest daughter's iPad was replaced with a new device, with a completely new account and no connection to any previous history, and the location application was uninstalled by a family decision that required little discussion. Life returned to the appearance of normalcy that had been interrupted that January afternoon, but with a permanent awareness that had not existed before, and that David described in testimony as the real cost of that incident, more lasting than any financial amount and harder to name than any legal violation. It was the awareness that the protection he had assumed existed around his family had turned out to be conditional in a way he had not calculated. The case entered the legal record as one of the first to establish specific precedent regarding the use of digital location data as the basis for federal operations at private residences. It was cited in legislative discussions about regulating the use of data by immigration agencies, and was referenced by digital rights organizations as evidence of the need for clearer limits on how data generated by personal devices can be used in government investigations. The body camera that had recorded everything that afternoon, the same equipment the agents had worn on their chests as standard protocol without imagining what that file would become, remained as public evidence viewable by anyone who wanted to see what happens when technology, power, and negligence meet at the door of a family that had done absolutely nothing wrong. Sometimes the camera meant to protect the institution is the same one that shows why it needs to be held accountable.
Equity is an ongoing path, and information is your greatest armor. We appreciate your viewership and dedication to undeniable truth.